welcome to Sound Heal Podcast. I am your host, Natalie Brown, and thank you so much for joining me as we continue to explore the fields of sound healing, sound therapy, and generally the use of sound for health and wellness. And this is our last episode of 2021. Thank you so much for your support this year and over the past 3 years. Yes, it's been 3 years of doing this podcast, and what a wonderful archive of conversations of people in this sound field. Just looking back, thinking of all the different perspectives, the journeys, the stories, the experiences people have shared. I'm just so grateful for my own learning and curiosity, being able to enjoy these people and the interviews. But also, thank you so much for listening, for your support and encouragement of this podcast, really helping lift up the sound healing field. And also, thank you so much for listening, because I did receive the notice that this podcast, Sounds Heal Podcast, is number 2 in the world in the sound therapy and music therapy podcast arena genre. So that comes from FeedSpot, and they are the most comprehensive kind of collector of statistics when it comes to podcasts. So wow, what an honor. And that's obviously through your support and listening. And thank you so much for supporting this archive of work and helping support the sound healing field. Also, thank you so much to the Om Shop and Spa. It's been a couple years now that they've been sponsoring this podcast, and what a wonderful collaboration. And they too are really trying to help people in this profession, find instruments, really find some vibrational tools to help lift others' spirits. And it's just been a wonderful collaboration. So thank you so much to the Om Shop and Spa for their support as well. Today we have Peter Blum on the podcast, and what a fascinating exploration and life Peter has. We start by learning, really about his background, his story, his hunger for learning and exploration, initially when it comes to music, and growing up in New York and then Woodstock, really kind of exploring different spiritual practices. And then his main profession is hypnosis. And so now this wonderful combination that he has of hypnosis work, trance work, sound work, and shamanic practices as well. So really fascinating and inspiring conversation with Peter that just sparks your interest to just be hungry for, and curious, and just always wanting to learn, and always having a patience and commitment when it comes to these type of practices and this type of work. So please enjoy this podcast with Peter Blum.
Got it.
All right. Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Peter. It's wonderful to be able to actually speak with you. I've seen you online in various Facebook groups for years now, but I'm so glad that we're connecting here and able to have this conversation. So thanks for doing this with me.
It's my pleasure, and I'm very honored to be in such illustrious company.
Oh, yes. Thank you. Thank you. Yes. And why don't it's been really fun to kind of review your work, especially through your website, which has so much information, just to see how, your individual path, your backstory has all led you to this combination of using hypnosis, sound practices, as well as spiritual and shamanic practices. So I think what's so wonderful about these conversations within this podcast is, there is something individual about everyone, and everything in your path led you to what you do now. So I'm curious about your background, and we could start with maybe your musical influences when you were younger.
All right. I consider myself very fortunate. I've noticed this, by the way. I also want to, thank you for doing this. This is a tremendous service, and you're building an archive of of resources that those of us in the sound healing community can refer to and know more about who's doing what. And as I've been preparing and watching this, I've noticed a number of people talking about early influences very early on. And I was fortunate enough to incarnate into a family that appreciated music, and there was a piano in the house, and my dad was an aspiring opera singer, and um, and my mom also was an artist, a professional watercolor artist. So there was a great appreciation for the arts. It was part of my daily life growing up that my dad was performing in various semi-professional opera uh, companies. Opera, as you may know, there's very little top. There's only a few, and he wasn't quite there, but almost. So he aspired to do that, and he also sang because he just loved voice, and he sang in both um, temple and church choirs. It wasn't about the religion; it was about singing, and he loved doing that, and that was a sort of a second source of income for his day job. And when we would go on car trips, my sister, who's 7 years younger than I, and my parents and I, we would sing in the car, the whole family. And I innocently thought, oh, this is what every family does. But sadly, no. And so music was all around. And I remember right around, I tried piano lessons, it didn't take. But I listened to all kinds of music, and I remember there was a radio station in New York City, WQXR, which was the radio station of the New York Times, and they played primarily classical music, which was on in my house a lot. That's, I discovered jazz and folk through my friends and who were pursuing their own interests. And I remember getting a guitar at around the age of 12. And also, there was a radio station in New York City that I would listen to, which played rock and roll. But the DJ, Murray the K, had gotten a hold of Baba Ola Tunji's Drums of Passion, which came out in like 1958 or 59. And he would play little excerpts from that in between. And that sound, I was like, what is that sound? And the other thing that was that QXR had a little diversity in their programming, in that every Sunday afternoon they would have an hour or two. And now I want to put this in a time frame. This is 57, 59. I was born in 1947. So I was about 10 or 12. They would have an hour or two of North Indian classical music, which was, nobody knew what that was. But I would listen to these sounds. They were unlike anything else around, and yet they were so familiar. And I don't know if it was a past life or a precog, but they just drew me. And they would also do modern music, like the music of John Cage and Schoenberg and um, one of the people you interviewed was John Beaulieu, who's a friend of mine and lives close by, and we've taught together a few times, and he's a fun guy. And John moved to New York from wherever he was in the Midlands to study with Xenakis, who was a very avant-garde composer. So these sounds, musique concrète, it was called, and found music and sounds were also fascinating to me. So I had this real mix of all sorts of stuff. I used to listen to, there was a jazz DJ in New York who had a late night show, and I would take my transistor radio because I was supposed to be asleep, and I would take it in bed and listen under the covers to Symphony Sid playing, Mongo Santa Maria and Dave Brubeck and John Coltrane. And so there was that coming in too. And then came the 60s. And I am a child of the 60s. I came of age in that time, and there was sex, drugs, and rock and roll, and I participated in all of them. And it was a time of tremendous exploration, exploring consciousness, finding out about yoga and meditation in the 60s. And I would tell people I'm doing yoga. And they would say, isn't that cultured dairy product you buy at the health food store? No, that's yogurt. This is yoga. So I found hatha yoga. And then I went to a concert. Somebody gifted me with tickets to a concert, second row at Philharmonic Hall, Lincoln Center in New York City, in 1968, I believe it was, Ravi Shankar. This was I think it was, yeah, definitely before Woodstock and before the big festival he played in California, Monterey Pop. But I wanted to hear live Indian music, and I went, and I was in an altered state of consciousness before going. I mean, full disclosure. But I sat there and I saw colors coming off of the strings as he was playing, which is a common side effect of some of the psychoactive substances is you get synesthesia. You hear, you hear purple, right? By the way, one of the people I hung out with in high school was somebody that we all thought was very gifted and would go on to have a great career. And she was writing songs even then. That was Laura Nyro. Laura Nyro, who Miles Davis was a big fan of. And, she would give when she would go into this recording studio, she would give them instructions, not musical, but she would say, I would like a magenta feel here, so there's that kind of crossover that we code things in terms of how they feel, how they look. A sound has maybe a smell to it as well. It enriches it. So anyway, that was very transformative, that experience. And I later so then I moved from New York City, where I was born and spent my formative years. And in 1969, at the age of 22, I moved to Woodstock, New York, which is where I've been more or less living ever since. And it is a hotbed. It's like a giant petri dish of artists and musicians. And Pat Metheny and Jack DeJohnette, great jazz players, have lived here. John Sebastian and Paul Butterfield and his whole band. And I was an aspiring blues harmonica player at that time as well. And so these were my heroes. And Bob Dylan had lived here and had just left right before I got here. So I felt like I was in the right place. And I started, somebody handed me a book. And it was the Sufi message of Hastrad Inayat Khan, Volume 2, The Mysticism of Sound and Breath and Music. And I remember, as clearly as if it were that day, opening it and reading it. And it was like the letters were fiery letters. They were coming off the page at me. I'd never encountered anyone speaking about my experiences with sound in a kind of mystical setting, and it gave me a framework to pursue this. I always knew that sound and music for me were a lot more than entertainment. They touched me deeply. I would hear Stravinsky's The Rite of Spring would come on WQXR, and I'd be transfigured, or Carmina Burana. Certain works of music would do that to me. And going to hear Jimi Hendrix live, and so I was pursuing this and exploring different traditions and that used sound, and many of them focused on the vocal aspect of it. Many of the ancient traditions focused on the vocal aspect. And even though my dad had been a professional opera singer, I had some fifth chakra trauma. You know, I would hear recordings of myself singing on a cassette player, and I go, I don't like that sound. You know, so there's some getting a better relationship with my voice was very important, and taking it off of the stage and out of the realm of performance. And I guess one of the things I want to say is that anything that I do with other people, anything that I have come to the point of sharing, either in performance, recording, or teaching, initially started as my own search, my own practices. And I we had a little newspaper, a little alternative newspaper in Woodstock in 1974. And I was asked by the editor who knew me to write a piece. And I just, I, it's, right, music, sound and music as sadhana from 1974. Sadhana is your spiritual practice. And I was trying to find what were the roots in all, what was the transcultural that was global. What was it that connected us all? There was no world music. That term hadn't come for quite a while, but I was listening to Tibetan Buddhist deep voice singing. I was listening to gamelan music from Indonesia. I wanted to, and all of these touched a different part of me. I was trying, like, what's the connective thread? What is the unifying principle amongst all of them? I still can't give a coherent answer to that, a one sentence answer, but there's something there that it's a deeply touching and evocative experience that people have with sound. It is said that it is the first organ, that a sense perception that develops in the womb, right? That the fetus is actually shaped like an ear, right? And there's no light in the womb, right? We can't see anything. It's totally dark, but there is sound, and we hear the sound of whoosh, whoosh, which is the sound of mother's breathing. And some say that's why the sound of the ocean is so calming, because it's very similar. The surf coming in and out is like the breath. And we hear boom, 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 and mother's heartbeat. And these little high-pitched sounds that, I used to stand up for a second here and do this. Those kind of sounds that we've discovered now how to make with gongs are sounds like dolphins and whales, and they're also like Jonathan Goldman. I think, have you interviewed Jonathan yet? All right. Well, he was one of the forerunners in this movement. He had Sound Healers Association. He released some recordings that had those ocean sounds and drums, heartbeat drum, and these sounds. And I think it was he who was writing early on, might have been Don Campbell, one of those guys, about this is the way the infant in the womb perceives the sound of mother's voice. It's very high pitched and distant, can't really make out words, but you hear this fascinating stuff. So these are, we're hardwired with these sounds from early on, and they are very evocative for us. So I realize this is a long answer to a short question, but I think it's relevant because, my friend, Dr. Louis Mehl-Madrona, who's not involved with sound, but is a psychiatrist who works a lot with hypnosis and with story. And he's been a mentor and a friend of mine, and we've taught together for years. He's written a number of books. And he said, honoring those who formed us. So that's very important. I always, if you go to traditional healers, they will always have a list of acknowledgments of, I'm indebted to this teacher and that teacher and that teacher. So, in 19, I would name my dad, first of all, for inspiring me with a love of sound. And although he did have his biases, I remember playing, Bob Dylan came on the car radio. I was like, Dad, listen to this. And he said, that's not singing. So there's a certain, criteria that was being applied but in the early 70s, after I had these experiences, and I wrote right around the time I wrote this article, a gentleman named Karl Berger, Dr. Karl Hans Berger, and his wife Ingrid moved to Woodstock. And they had started a school in New York City with the help of Ornette Coleman. And it was the Creative Music Studio. And their idea, they're both still going, they're in their 80s, but Karl was an award-winning downbeat jazz musician on vibraphone who had played with Don Cherry and top players, and a music educator. And they had this idea of, again, I'm like, okay, now I found it. This is what I was looking for, of teaching universal tuning and universal timing. In other words, they wanted to bring in musicians from Turkey and from Africa and jazz musicians and show this is the stuff that connects. If you look underneath the rug, these are the threads that connect all the different patterns you're seeing that transcend culture. And so that was a tremendous school for me, because I never went to music school. I was an autodidact. I found friends to teach me stuff on the guitar. The other thing I forgot to mention was that at 13, I grew up not really practicing, but kind of secular Jewish. And at the age of 13, a young man is bar mitzvahed, which is a rite of passage. And what I had asked my parents for as my present, my big present, was a kunga drum. So I had a kunga drum, and as I was going through teenage angst in my room and not wanting to do my homework with the door closed, I would either be playing my kunga drum or playing for hours on my guitar. And I remember my dad at one point saying, "It's fine, Pete, if you want to do that stuff, that's fine, but don't ever think that you're going to support yourself doing it." There was a real mixed message there, like the pursuit of music is fine, but you got to find something else to do. So anyway, I still love percussion. I've always loved percussion, and I always loved getting together with friends and drumming, drum circles and little drum sanghas and percussion sanghas. And I have a large collection of rattles and drums and shakers. And I like having a repertoire or an array of different things that I can use. And so that then takes us into the late 70s. And I was playing my guitar and trying to make it sound like a sitar, using open tunings for the sympathetic strings, and listening to what John McLaughlin was doing and being just in awe of that. And I moved to live in Holland for 3 years. In 1978, I moved to Amsterdam, and there was an expatriate jazz pianist living there who Burton Green. And Burton Green was, I was referred to him to look him up, and we hung out, and he said, "You have to come and hear this group I'm playing with, the East West Trio." And it was him and a bongo player from Suriname and this extraordinary sitarist from India. And I just was absolutely, there are moments when there's this sense of manifest destiny unfolding. And I was like, I need to meet this man and I need to get some teaching from him. So I went, his name was Ustad Jamaluddin Bhartiya. He was Ravi Shankar's first and oldest student. He was in that Gharana, in that lineage. And he had a school there in Amsterdam of North Indian classical music. And I went, and he kind of grudgingly accepted me as a student. We went through a little dance back and forth where um, I said, I'd like to learn raga scales on the guitar. And I played a little bit on the guitar what I was doing. And he said, well, you have some good musical ability, but I can't really teach you on that instrument. You're going to have to learn on sitar. So there's, you're probably familiar with Zen mind, beginner's mind. So that was good for me because there I was stripped of my whatever 15 years of playing guitar before that. And there I was a complete beginner. And even though it was a stringed instrument with frets, it was very different. So, I spent like 6 months learning to hold it. and another 6 months learning just to play scales. And then I learned my first. And he sat with me and he said, listen, if I teach you, you must promise that you will practice for 3 hours every day. And I said, well, I can't really do that. I have a full-time job and two small children. And he said, all right, then 2 hours a day. And I was still wiggling off the hook. And I said, I would like to say yes, some days I might be able to, but I don't think I can make that promise for every day. And he very sternly looked at me and he said, 1 hour a day, absolute minimum. Otherwise, it will be a waste of your time and mine. So there's this tradition. It's not like here where you go and open the newspaper and you look for an ad for a good, a piano teacher or voice teacher. If he accepted me as we entered into a very ancient and privileged relationship of Guru Chela. I was his student and he took some responsibility and I tried to do everything I could to hang around him and learn from him and driving him to gigs and playing the tambura for him, which was a great honor, and just for hours playing those same four strings over and over again while this font of creativity was going on several feet from me. So that was 3 years I did that. And then I moved back to the States and I organized, he wanted to come and tour and I organized some tours for him. And I also went back to studying again with Creative Music Studio with Karl. And I also met right around that time in the early 80s another person who was to become a profound teacher of mine whom I saw Katie Down pay homage to, which was Pauline Oliveros. And Pauline had just moved to this area. There's a Zen monastery, Zen mountain monastery. She was an artist in resident at, and she was doing a class at Creative Music Studio. It was one of those moments where I opened up the newspaper and there was a picture of this person, and I thought, I need to go meet this person. I didn't know anything about her. There was some recognition, and I went and we became friends. And then I was following her around, and she had a deep listening chorus in Kingston, New York, which is about 15-20 minutes from Woodstock. And she said, asked me to be the chorus master because I was experimenting with a lot of vocal sounds, and I'd heard Glenn Velez, the wonderful frame drummer. And you know Glenn Velez's work? Yeah. So I'd heard Glenn Velez, and also in the process of booking gigs for my sitar teacher, I reached out to Steve Gorn. Steve Gorn has since become a colleague, and I've had the honor of performing and recording with him. But at that point, I just knew him as like one of the few Westerners who was held in very high regard by Indian musicians as a master of the Bansuri flute. So Steve was performing with Glenn Velez and Lane Redmond as a trio at that point. And I went to a performance and Glenn was playing the frame drum, and I heard this sound and I thought somebody was whistling from off camera, from behind a curtain somewhere. I couldn't figure out what the sound was. And it turns out it was Glenn doing throat singing or harmonic singing. And again, I was hooked. I was like, I need to find out about this. And how the heck does he do that? And I was off and running, and I found teachers, and I in fact dragged Pauline over to Omega Institute one year for a class with Jill Peirce, the English lady who was one of the pioneers in bringing harmonic singing into the West. And recently, because my days, I'm teaching a lot, but my days as a student still continue. I still keep trying to find people to teach me more. And so most recently, I've had the great good fortune of studying with Timothy Hill. And Timothy was, along with David Heitz, the two main forces behind the harmonic choir. And he's probably the best harmonic singer that I've ever had the chance to hang with. And he's quite a student of the overtone series. And it's very meditative. We have small classes of, 3, 4, 5 people in somebody's living room. And of course, more recently, there's been concern with COVID protocols because you can't really sing with a mask on. So it was not going on for a while, but we've resumed again. And so exploring that. And one of the podcasts that I watched was Nestor, whom I didn't know of him, but I liked a lot of what he had to say. And so this, these are my areas of interest. And I was like, well, what is it that the singing bowls? All right, I'm known as a bowl guy, right? And that more than anything is probably what people say. Oh, you're that guy that does the singing bowls. And I again, I see this as an extension of fascination with sounds that have long duration, sounds that are rich in harmonics and in overtones, and percussion, because it is percussion. And as far as I can tell, anything like this, I'm just going to tilt anything like that, which is a small selection of singing bowls. I have a client coming over in a couple hours who's coming for a little sound healing session, so I've got about 40 bowls, and I just grabbed out, like the old song says, these are a few of my favorite bowls. So I have a few. But that again, where did it come from? I heard a recording in the 70s of Nancy Hennings and Henry Wolf, Tibetan bells. And what are those sounds? And I just was very curious. You couldn't find in these, they weren't around. And slowly through the diaspora of the Tibetan people and them, they started appearing more and more in Tibetan shops, import shops. And a fellow named Dirk Gillebel arrived in Woodstock, and I want to say the 80s. And he had studied with a fellow, he's Belgian, and he had studied with a Hungarian shaman named Juska Sos. And Juska used the bowls, and Dirk had a collection of bowls. And I went to a couple meditations he was giving where people would lay on their backs and he would play singing bowls. And also, right around that time, I met Don Conreaux, the gong master, who came through Woodstock and did some gonging. And I began slowly. I got my first bowl, and then I developed a bowl Jones, and I could not stop. I just had to get more and more and more, and I was playing them for myself. And then someone said, "Well, you could do what Dirk is doing. You're a musician. You could." And I very timidly invited a handful of about, I don't know, a dozen friends to a small gathering, and I played the bowls, just like I had been playing them in my living room. And my friend Burl who was a filmmaker who made the Women in Jazz series, award-winning videographer on PBS, and he just passed a month ago. Burl Crone came up to me and he said, "That's the closest I've ever seen you in your essence." So that was a hint, that it's like follow the breadcrumbs. You're on the right track. You're on the right trail. And, I was just doing this for myself and my friends, and I played them for my partner who was having some health issues, and she said it made her feel better. I mean, physically, not just emotionally and mentally, but it physically seemed to have some. So I'm very, it's a very touchy subject and phrase, sound healing. You have the Sounds Heal podcast. My website is Sounds for Healing. But still, what is going on? Who's doing the healing? Benjamin Franklin said, God heals, the physician entertains and collects the fee. So, whether you believe in it's coming from a divine source or from the inner physician, in a sense, maybe all healing is self-healing. What we can do is create the conditions that are conducive to it, to create an environment where people feel some change is possible, some grace can enter into the room, can be experienced. It's very mysterious. Even the scientists don't really know, you know. So anyway, I was doing this stuff, and my friend said, "I want you to meet this my friend Laurence Rockefeller," and he was, one of the probably half dozen richest men in the world, who was the black sheep of the Rockefeller family. He funded crop circle conferences. He gave big donations to the Foundation for Shamanic Studies, Michael Horner's group, Joan Halifax. He hung out with Ram Dass. He was, he was a very inquisitive and charming man. And she said, I want Laurence to experience what you're doing. And I was, that's the expression, in for a penny, in for a pound, is why not? I'm doing this for, I hadn't really started doing much with it, but it was something that I had a fascination with. I know that these sounds affected me more profoundly than just about anything else. I love singing, overtone singing. I love drumming. I love playing the tambura, but the bowls just had something else going on for them that let's see, like this is one of the first bowls, and I know the Zoom audio interface is not great, but this is one of the first bowls that I got, and it's still one of my favorites, and it just has a so when people are looking for bowls, they'll say, what should I look for? I say, well, ease of playing, and purity of tone, and duration. A good bowl, when you strike a good bowl, it will ring for a long, long, long time. So anyway, I did a session for Laurence Rockefeller. Here's this, 85-year-old billionaire laying on cushions, and I'm playing the balls around him, and he got it. And he sat up and he said, These are healing sounds. These are sounds that people in hospitals who are waiting for surgery or post surgery should be able to hear. I said, yeah, I'm sure. Sounds good to me. Why not? And then my friend said to me, read between the lines. This man is a huge philanthropist. He's given you the nod. So I very kind of cautiously wrote a note to him. Thank you for, I'm so glad that you appreciated them, and I have some ideas for making some recordings and maybe writing a book. And I don't know if you can help me, but I know that you've been generous to other people. And that he then became my what every artist dreams of. I got a patron. This was in 1997, and through his generosity, I was able to go into a recording studio and record four. I was going to record one, and my friend who I hired as a musician I used to perform with, Mark Black, we played. We had a trio called Older Than Dirt, but we kind of did like folk space music. And Mark was a creative guy and had a lot of experience in recording studios. And I said, "Would you help me? Would you produce this?" And he said, "Pete, why are you doing one? You got so much stuff to offer, and you're a hypnotherapist, and you could bring that in, and you could do some spoken inductions with the sounds in the back." So I ended up giving birth to quadruplets, and I put out 4 CDs. It took me 2 years to record them and find the right microphones and the right engineers who were understood. I said, these sounds have like the lowest and the highest frequencies. You have to be able to get the full range. And Mark encouraged me. He said, well, you do drumming. Why don't you bring in some drummers, do some percussion, do some chanting, do some. So that it grew and grew. And because I had, funding, I was like, why not? Why not? And, my friend who had introduced me to Laurence said, this could be your best shot this lifetime. Don't F it up. So anyway, I took my time and I put out those 4 CDs. And then he called me to Rockefeller Plaza, and he said, well, okay, now how are you going to market these? And I had no idea. I was like, I don't know. I'm the artist. But he was saying, no, if you're going to do this, he was very good advice. You have to figure out, come up with a plan. So I got a website up. And that was my first website. And it was called Entrance Ways, which I thought was very clever. And then I didn't renew it, and somebody stole it. So I had to come up with another name, which is actually a better name, because Entranceways is very clever, but people don't really understand what that means. And so I did Sounds for Healing, which is more, sounds for healing. And so I guess what I had not mentioned in this retrospective is that the main way that I've been earning a living since I don't know when. It's been a long time. since 1987 or 88 is I got trained as a hypnotherapist, and I have a practice in medical and clinical and Ericksonian and neo-Ericksonian hypnosis. So for me, there was a great fascination in the overlap is what happens to people? What happens when people are hearing these sounds, and how is it related to what happens to people when I'm speaking to them and they go into an altered state? They both share this. I'm talking a lot. Do you have any questions?
Well, getting into hypnosis, of course, which has been your full time, your main field.
Yeah,
And did I just read that you've been inducted into a Hall of Fame for hypnotherapy? Is that right?
yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, this is, you've expressed all these amazing experiences and exploration of sound, but I think they do really
You know what we used to say in New York,
correlate.
with that and a token you can get on the subway.
Yeah. Right.
You
Yeah.
know, I
Yeah.
mean, it's nice to be honored by your peers in the field,
Yes.
and
Yeah.
say, this is, you made a significant contribution, and that was, my chosen field, um, and I entered that field in the late 80s, and became trained in hypnosis, and um, so I was always like looking at this through binoculars. One lens is like, here's this powerful effect on the psyche, on sounds for healing. That was, and here's how people engage in hypnotic practices dating back to Mesmer and before that, to go into an altered state for purposes of creativity, healing, accessing parts of themselves that are not normally accessed. So I was it was sort of inevitable that it would lead eventually to this, which is, my little contribution here, Trance Sonics,
Trance Sonics. Yeah.
the vital link between sound healing and hypnosis, because I just thought I have a fair amount of experience in both of those, and seeing the overlap, and trying to, it's like, let me explain to the hypnotists, many of whom don't know about sound and music, about the powerful healing and consciousness altering effects of sound. And let me explain to the sound healers and musicians, this is nothing new. Mesmer used sound. I mean, the use of sound induces a hypnotic state, a trance state. There's a trance dancing in Bali, and in Africa, and a very many ancient traditions of using sound and music to go into an altered state. So, this is my sort of, what can I contribute that's unique. There's nothing new under the sun. I think King Solomon said that. But I at least feel like this is sort of, I have a fair amount of experience in these two areas for decades. And I'm by following our own fascinations, that's what leads to illumination, right? So it's not because someone told me about this. It's just, I've always, I used to think, I thought Gerald McBoing Boing was one of my spirit guides. Do you know Gerald McBoing Boing? Maybe it was before your time. He was a cartoon character that would come on before movies in like the early 50s, and he didn't speak. He just made sounds. So, sound, growing up, with a father who was an operatic baritone, uh, voice was God in my family growing up. So there's, this respect for what is that, that affects us so deeply, right? In every culture throughout history.
So, through all your explorations and all these really amazing adventures that have led you through this path of exploration and continued learning, now looking at the field of sound healing now, it's really blossomed. Um, what do you think is most important right now for people that are curious about this field, um, and to be mindful of, to be aware of?
Uh, so my dad, who was an inspiration to me because he was an opera singer, and so that was, that was a very important aspect growing up in a home where music was so important. And he had a little note by his desk where he worked that said, all, it was a quote from someone, I don't know who, all true knowledge comes from direct experience. And I know that as this field, I've seen this field blossom and bloom, there are a lot of overnight experts and a lot of people who go and they take a weekend seminar and the next week they're teaching something. And I was, it's fine to be enthusiastic, but if you look traditionally, there was a period of like 40 years of apprenticeship for a bard before they were, my Indian music teacher, from whom I learned, sitar in 1978, he said, there is a commitment here that it's not like in the West where you open the newspaper and you see look for an ad for piano teacher or guitar teacher. If I agree to take you on as my student, I'm making a commitment to you, and you need to make a commitment to the music. And he said, are you willing to practice? You have to promise that you'll practice for 3 hours a day.
Right. So really that
And
people getting into this field, they need to make a commitment, right? You can't just be a weekend expert.
Right, make a commitment, and everything that I teach are things that I initially pursued out of my own curiosity. I wasn't looking to become a sound healer or I was just like driven by wow, why does that sound affect me the way that it does? What is it about African drumming that moves me? I've never been to Africa. What is it about Tibetan overtone singing? What are the connecting threads? So they say the pursuit of one's destiny unfolds in following one's passion. So as I just was following these things because they were like fascinating to me. Why does sound affect me this way? Why do certain sounds affect me more than other sounds? And so, I would encourage everyone to take their time, enjoy listening to music and sounds from all over. People will go now and they will take a weekend of, crystal bowls or tuning forks, and the next week they're teaching it. And, I would just say, have a little respect for the maturation process. I myself was very reluctant to step into the role of teaching for a long time because I said, no, this is just my stuff. This is my sadhana. This is my practice. I get together with a few friends every week and we sit and we meditate and we groan. We groan to God. And it was just an exploration of vocal harmonics. I hadn't heard this, we'd heard some recordings of Tibetan Buddhists chanting, and then a little bit later some of the Tuvan singing. But I was just following the breadcrumbs, So it's a wonderful sadhana. Sadhana is a spiritual practice, and everything that came out of that, my recordings and doing workshops and teaching, is wanting to share something that's been so rewarding and so rich for me.
Yeah, it's just a beautiful combination of your passions and everything that you were drawn to, and gosh, that's just what fascinates me so much about this field is everybody's individual journey, and I don't think we can have any doubt that everything led you to what you're doing. Everything led you
Everything
to
did.
passion. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
And I'm particularly fascinated, because of my dual career. The main way that I've generated income since the mid 80s is having a career as a clinical medical hypnotist and being an instructor of hypnosis and investigating historically what is the link between trance states and sound. You cannot be involved in the field of sound healing and not be interested in what's going on in consciousness and in the brain as well as in the body when people are exposed to certain vibrations, and why do certain sounds affect us more than certain other sounds. So
Right. And is it different for everybody, right? Does everybody resonate differently, or are there commonalities? I mean, that's the whole perhaps moral to the story is be
well, one
curious, be curious.
yes,
Yeah.
yes, and one thing that's been very, very reassuring has been the growth of this field. Because when when I read Hastrad Inayat Khan's book in 1971 or 270, and there were maybe two or three books out on the sound mysticism, sound healing. There was very, very little, and now it's become much more mainstream. And there's a pro and a con to that, of course, right? But overall, I would say it's a good thing.
Gosh, thank you so much for your time and sharing your journey of exploration. And it's just so exciting to even envision everything you've experienced and so much that you've shared through, both the sound work and hypnosis and the combination of exploring those two. Any last words you want to share with the audience?
Oh, make a joyful noise unto the Lord. All right. In the Hebrew wisdom, they say, God listens when I pray and loves me when I sing.
Yeah, beautiful. Okay, thank you so much, Peter.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you for tuning into this episode of Sounds Heal Podcast, sponsored by the Om Shop and Spa. You can keep up to date with what's coming up next at soundshealstudio.com. Check things out on Facebook at Sounds Heal Studio, and you can listen to all previous podcasts as well as music meditations on the YouTube channel at Sounds Heal Studio. Be well and stay tuned.